Sophie. I am a senior data journalist at the Office for National Statistics, based in Newport, in Wales. And yeah, if you want to note the slide decks for later, there's a little link on there, but I'll also show it at the end if you want to have a look later. Essentially, my goals for today are to convince you that there is a problem with communication in the data science community and in kind of like data-related topics generally, to give you some ideas for how to solve it and how to get better at communicating data, and also to show really good examples of work that other people are doing and to kind of give you some inspiration for how you might want to, communicate data in the future. So for me, I think the biggest problem that we face as people who work in the data kind of industry is data literacy. 1 in 4, so these are all statistics from the UK, so I don't imagine it's going to be massively different for other countries, but 1 in 4 people don't feel confident using maths. That's a quarter of people, which is crazy. So if they don't understand maths, how can they possibly hope to understand data, which is, sometimes much more complicated than that? 1 in 6 people were able to answer 3 basic maths questions, and that's from the National Numeracy Organisation, which is a charity about trying to increase numeracy. Again, that's kind of scary that 1 in 6 people could actually answer really basic maths questions. And 1 in 4 people don't understand their own payslip. So obviously, I show you these statistics because it's really important that you understand like the kind of level of literacy in terms of data, in terms of numbers, is very, very low. And that's kind of worrying. And for us, that's, if you're trying to reach a mass audience, or if you're trying to broaden your audience to people who aren't working in academia, who aren't working in economics, who don't know this stuff, that's a challenge that we have to face. So I don't know about you, but I often find when I talk to people about what I do, they kind of look at me like this. They kind of don't know, they hear maths or data and they just like freak out. And they kind of find themselves thinking, oh my gosh, that's so scary. Like, people are really scared of numbers. And so, yeah, it's kind of how do you break through to those people who aren't confident with numbers, who don't understand, kind of mathematical problems and that kind of thing. So I would kind of urge you to try and think of your data as a starting point for telling a story. And the reason that I say that is because, this is a really good quote from Alberto Cairo, who is an author. He's written 3 or 4 books about data visualization, and he's brilliant. And if you are interested in this field, he's definitely someone to follow on Twitter and also to kind of look at his past work. But he says, it's in the combination of words and visuals that the magic of understanding often happens. In other words, it's not just about writing a report that's, however many pages long, that's just got text in it. And it's also not just about providing the visualization, it's actually the combination of the two that makes it easier for people to understand. And I thought that was a really, really good quote and really relevant for what we're doing. So in terms of why would I ask you to think of it as storytelling? It's because humans are very social creatures. We have been telling each other stories and passing stories down from generation to generation. That's how we connect as humans. And it's also much easier to understand something if you're given it in a narrative. So rather than being given the raw numbers, if you're told it in the context of a story, it's much easier to remember, it's much easier to understand. So I guess my point of this is, it's just, for me, it makes so much sense to write, to kind of think of stories from data and to write in a kind of storytelling way. In terms of how you can think of that and how you can maybe incorporate that into your work, I think the thing I always ask myself when I'm looking at a data set or I'm working on a story, which is what I do for most of my work, is I think about, okay, what in this data set is really surprising? If I told my friend about it, would they go, I never knew that, I've learned something? Or would they be, would it change their mind on something? Would it be something that they would tell their friends that they were kind of interested in? So you have to kind of ask yourself, what's really surprising? What stands out in the data? What was unexpected? And also, I kind of think about it as people talking in the pub. If you went to the pub and you said, "Oh, I've done this amazing, deep learning thing," and I think their eyes would glaze over, right? If they're not in this data world. Whereas I think if you kind of tell it as a story, like, here are the things that I found. Did you know this? That's kind of the way I would encourage you to look at it and to think about it. And also, technical words also really put people off. So clearly, that's not a good way to kind of go about it. And also, I've put at the end there, can you add a human perspective to it? And what I mean by that is, in journalism, when we do data journalism particularly, we know that people aren't just interested in data for the sake of data. They want to know, how is inflation going to affect me? How do you see yourself in that data? How can you let people place themselves within that data? So it's that kind of, how can you help people to understand how it impacts them? That's what I mean by that. And yeah, if you want to kind of broaden your audience, I think you need to think as well about how you do data visualization as well as telling stories. And you can use data visualization to help tell stories. My key things for this would be, you need to pick the most important stories and relationships in your data. So what I mean by that is, obviously, if you're interested in something that's changed over time, that's kind of that's the relationship you want to show. Or if you want to show how two numbers have changed differently, the diversion, that's what you want to show. So you need to think about when you know what the most important thing in your data is, you need to think about the relationships that you want to show. And then, of course, you need to pick the right chart, which I will go into in a minute. And also, don't be afraid to editorialize on charts. And what I mean by that is by making the headline of the title for the chart accessible, by making it into a story. And I've got some examples that I can show you as well. And also, I think a really, really important and underused thing in chart making is annotation. If you annotate charts, you can kind of lead the reader to understand what you're trying to say. So rather than leaving it to their interpretation of what you've kind of given them in a chart form, you can kind of talk them through by annotating in the chart itself. And again, I've got some more examples of that. So some relationships, this isn't an exhaustive list, but some of the relationships and the corresponding chart types that you might want to look at are deviation, change over time, as I said, where you'd probably use like a line chart or a column chart or maybe a slope chart if you're looking at 2 points in time that you want to compare. Part to whole, I've put pie charts are because I really hate pie charts. So I would encourage you not to use pie charts because they're quite misleading. But Marimekko charts and tree charts where you've got different bits of data take up different space. And distribution, which would be a common one, histograms, B-swarms, and stuff like that. So these are just a few ideas for the relationships that you might want to show and the chart types that you might want to use. And a really good resource for helping you if you're ever stuck on what kind of chart you want to use. This is the FT's visual vocabulary. It's really awesome, and it's really helpful. If you Google it, it comes up, it's hosted on GitHub. And at the top, you've got the relationship that you want to show, so what you're kind of aiming for. And then the diagrams down, I know you might not be able to see them because it's quite big, but the diagrams show which kind of charts might work best for that relationship that you're trying to show, for whatever you're trying to bring out of the data. So I would encourage you to look at that as well. So I'm going to show a few examples. So this is a chart from the Financial Times. It's actually quite a recent one. And it was in a piece called What's Killing Us Now, which is about death in England and Wales over 175 years. And the reason that I wanted to show you this is because, although obviously it's a heat map, we all probably recognise that. And you could have just, they could have just chosen to just give you the heat map and then let you figure it out yourself. What they've done is they've annotated and they've said, okay, here's the context. Here was when the Spanish flu epidemic was happening. Here is when World War II happened, and all of that kind of thing that helped the reader to understand, okay, here's the context, because if you didn't know that, obviously pretty much everyone knows when the Second World War was, but it gives you more context so that you can, you can understand what the data is really telling you. So I think that's a very good example of how you can use annotation to great effect. This is an example from The Economist about exposure to air pollution and violent crime and the link between them. And the reason I picked this one is because one of the things that people really struggle with, and people who aren't in the statistics or economics world, one thing they really struggle with is uncertainty in projections and that kind of thing. So this is a really good way of, for me anyway, I thought it was a really good way of showing confidence intervals, which, I mean, obviously it's highlighted on there, it's an annotation showing the confidence interval, but it just kind of illustrates to people, this isn't certain, it could be between this and this. And I think that's quite useful for people who are, who are not really used to dealing with data and reading data visualizations and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's that one. And then this one is really brilliant. This is from the New York Times. This was part of an article called "Extensive Data Showed the Punishing Reach of Racism for Black Boys." And this was based on a study of, basically they looked at boys who grew up in rich families, who were white and black, and the different life outcomes they had. So whether they ended up as a rich adult, whether they ended up as a poor adult. And this is a really unusual visualization. It's actually, when you look on the website, it's an animation. It's not a still image. So basically the blocks come in from the left and you can see it filter out. And you can see very clearly that obviously more boys that were black ended up poorer adults than white boys, which is really, really interesting. And so some other examples of great visualization and great explanation of data viz. A really, really good example is something written by Alberto Cairo, who I mentioned earlier. He wrote a piece for the New York Times saying, those hurricane maps don't mean what you think they mean. And basically, what the problem was, the kind of cone maps that are normally used when we're predicting where hurricanes go, people don't understand them. So people who were they kind of assumed that middle line was the path that it was going to go to. So what they found was that people who were on the outside of that cone, they didn't prepare for the hurricane because they thought, oh, I'm not in the middle, it's not going to affect me. And it actually causes real-life problems when people don't understand visualization, people don't understand data. So that's a really good example of the article actually explains what it does mean and why it's important that people do understand it. So I thought that was a really good example. The second one is the birthday paradox by a website called The Pudding. The birthday paradox is the idea that I think if you're in a room with, I think, 23 people, there's you're quite likely to share a birthday with someone in the room, which is really interesting. And again, it's one of those mathematical things that it doesn't make any sense to a kind of layperson, but when you look at the maths, and this article is really good because it talks you through it, and it shows you kind of like in a graphical form how that worked, how that adds up. Another really great, this is more kind of data science-y type stuff. Google rewards reputable reporting and not left-wing politics, sorry, not left-wing politics, and that's from The Economist. And they basically looked at where they would expect websites to come up in Google search rankings for certain terms. And they saw that what we'd expect is actually what happens. So there's no bias in Google's algorithms towards or against any particular news outlet. So I thought that was very interesting as well. And also, the last one, the New York Times, let us predict whether you're a Democrat or Republican. That's obviously based on linear regression, and it's kind of a way of doing it in a quiz format is a really good way of getting people to engage with that data, because if you said to someone, oh, I've done a linear regression of what makes you more likely or less likely to be a Democrat or Republican, I think people would just tune out. So actually making it into a quiz or kind of makes it more engaging, makes it more interesting for people. So I definitely think that's a really good example too. So yeah, if you're interested in any of these kind of, any of these data stories, data journalism, data visualization, I do write a newsletter, as was mentioned earlier, and that's the address for it there. And it's basically a weekly newsletter that I send out on Sundays. And it's about, all of this kind of thing. It's looking at what people are doing in terms of storytelling with data. So I try and keep up to date with the new ways of presenting data, new ways of talking about data, new ways of analysing data, anything to do with that. I put it in that newsletter. So if you're interested, obviously I'm biased, but I would recommend looking at that if you want to. If you look at the website, there's lots of archives of previous newsletters that I've sent out, so you can see what kind of stuff I've written about. And that's me done. Thank you very much.